This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nissa, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today happens to be Christmas, so I went with a festive topic, and we'll be looking at Magic's Top 10 Elves. Elves are a part of the lore of Christmas. In some earlier stories about Santa Claus, he himself is an elf, and in virtually every depiction of him, he has elves who make toys that he delivers to children every Christmas. That's why this MTG Top 10 looks at elves. Now, Magic's elves don't bear much of a resemblance to Santa's elves, as most of Magic's elves don't seem like they would be interested in making toys, and they're certainly not the small creatures who work for Santa. Santa's elves are based more on medieval and early modern European folklore about elves, who are smaller, impish creatures, as opposed to the elves of Magic, who are based on those of high fantasy. But still, if we stretch things a bit, this top 10 is on theme for Christmas. In fact, it isn't the first time I thought this was a good idea for the holiday, as back in 2019, I also did a top 10 on elves on Christmas Day. It's been 4 years though, so the list has changed significantly. Elves are one of Magic's most prominent creature types. They're the representative type for green, which means they show up on just about every plane and really embody what green is all about. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have the elf type or be capable of making elf creature tokens. In all, there were 651 cards eligible for the video, and in it we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's start with a look at the cards that made the 2019 list but didn't make it this time, starting with Rishar, Pima, Renegade, which was at number 10 last time. For 2 generic and a green, Rishar is a 2/2 that puts a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures you control when it enters the battlefield, and each creature you control with a counter on it can tap for green mana. Importantly, Rishar can put a counter on himself, so he's going to be a 3/3 at worst, and the times where you can put both counters on creatures you already had in play feels even better, especially if you can do something with mana right away. Basically, he enhances your board and makes it pretty easy for you to double spell the turn you play him, while also ramping your mana in the long run. While in Standard, Rishar was played in the +1/+1 counter-centric Golgari Constrictor deck, which ran counter payoffs like the eponymous Constrictor. If you played the Constrictor on turn 2 and Rishar on turn 3, you ended up with a 4/5 and a 4/4, which was pretty insane for Standard. He hasn't seen a ton of play elsewhere since rotating out of the format, only picking up a single point in a Pioneer Bard class deck. While the 27 points were enough to make the list last time, the 28 points it has this time weren't anywhere close, as the number 10 card has 67 points. Next, there's Verdian Shaman, which was at number 9 last time. For 2 generic and a green, it's a 2/2 that destroys an artifact when it enters the battlefield. One thing that makes Santa's elves significantly different from Magic's elves is that elves in Magic are often depicted as hating technology. This is especially true on Mirrodin. Santa's elves would probably be artificers if they ever showed up in Magic, and there are not a whole lot of elf artificers in the game, though there are a few on Kaladesh. Anyway, Verdian Shaman is a good example of a technology-hating elf, as it gets all of its value out of the fact that it can blow up artifacts when it enters the battlefield. Any card that you can use to add to your board while taking something away from your opponent's board feels pretty great, and in the block and Standard Verdian Shaman was a part of, which of course involved Mirrodin block, she had targets a huge chunk of the time, serving as one of the best artifact hate cards in both formats, virtually always guaranteeing you a 2-for-1. Artifact-heavy decks were a thing in Extended and Legacy 2, and the Shaman was played as a sideboard card in a variety of decks in both formats. The Shaman hasn't been played anywhere since 2014 though, and that's mostly because a card that made the list this time has taken its place in decks looking for this type of effect. This elf won't ever find its way back on the list. Lastly, there's Servant of the Conduit, who was at number 6 last time. For 1 generic and a green, it's a 2/2 that gives you 2 energy when it enters the battlefield. You can tap it and use one of those energy to add mana of any color to your mana pool. Energy decks were dominant in Standard in 2017 and 2018, and it was partly because the deck had great mana thanks to cards like the Servant, who fixed and ramped your mana using all the energy your deck could produce. Energy decks were so good that there were a couple of bans to help make the deck weaker, but the Servant wasn't one of those bans, and it kept seeing play as long as it was in Standard. However, it hasn't gained a single point since rotating, and that's what led to it falling off the list despite a fairly high score. It missed the list by only 2 points, but it isn't going to get any easier for it to make the top 10 in the future. Alright, now that we took a look at the elves that are no longer on the list, let's move into the top 10, starting with Sylvan Advocate, which fell all the way down from its number 4 spot and just barely managed to hang on. For 1 generic and a green, this elf is a 2/3 with Vigilance, and as long as you control 6 or more lands, it and all of your creature lands get +2/+2. The Advocate would have been a decent card in any standard format, but it got an extra boost out of the fact that when it was a 4/5, it could survive one of the main board sweepers in that standard format, Languish. There weren't any other 2-drops who could make such a claim. It also didn't hurt that it also made your creature lands bigger, and there were some of those in the format. The efficiency of the Advocate virtually made it into a staple for green decks, and this was true in control, mid-range, and aggro builds. Control decks could play it alongside their Languishes, without being worried they would lose their Advocate, and the other decks could play it purely based on its efficiency. Just to name a few of the decks it was featured in, there was Collected Company, Green-White Token, Sultai Control, Gruul Ramp, and Golgari Constrictor. The Advocate hasn't gained a single point since it left Standard though, and if I revisit this list in the future, I can pretty much guarantee that the Advocate won't be here anymore. At number 9, it's Nissa Vastwood Seer, which was at number 5 last time. For 2 generic and a green, it's a 2/2 that lets you search up a basic forest and put it into your hand when she enters the battlefield. That's already a solid card, but wait, there's more. When a land enters the battlefield on your side, if you control 7 or more lands, she transforms into a Planeswalker, Nissa Sage Animist. She's a 3 loyalty Planeswalker with a +1 that draws a top card of your library and puts it on the battlefield if it's a land, a -2 that makes a 4/4 legendary token, and a -7 that untaps up to 6 lands and turns them into 6/6s. That's a pretty nice package to have. After all, she can draw you cards, protect herself with a token, and she has a game-winning ultimate. That's always a nice Planeswalker, especially because you only ever end up paying 3 mana for this one. She was one of the more heavily played cards in the Standard over time, and she was made especially attractive by the presence of Collected Company, since she was a creature you could grab with a powerful instant, and getting a Planeswalker out of Company felt pretty amazing. For about 6 years, Nissa didn't see play anywhere after rotating, but over the last 2 years, she has started to see play in Pioneer Elf decks. If it weren't for those 4 points she gained in those decks, she would have lost her spot on the list. It looks likely she's going to keep seeing play in Pioneer, but not so heavily that she's guaranteed a spot on the list going forward. At number 8, it's Leovold, Emissary of Trest, which was in the same spot last time. For a black, a green, and a blue, Leovold is a 3/3 that makes it so your opponent can't draw more than 1 card in a turn, and whenever a permanent you control is targeted by a spell or ability an opponent controls, you draw a card. Importantly, Leovold counts itself, so the best your opponent can often do is 2-for-1ing themselves. That, combined with the effect to limit your opponent's ability to draw cards, makes Leovold a great source of card advantage. Leovold was printed in Conspiracy Take the Crown, and that means the only 60-card formats it's ever been legal in are Legacy and Vintage. Leovold is proven to be more than strong enough for both formats, to the point that there are decks called Leovold in both of them. These are aggro control decks loaded up with efficient creatures who almost always make sure you're coming out ahead with card advantage. Card draw spells are really heavily played in both formats, and shutting those down is a huge deal. Leovold is going to keep gaining points in Legacy and Vintage. At number 7, it's Reclamation Sage, which was in the same spot last time. Earlier when discussing Verdian Shaman, I mentioned a newer card had taken its spot in multiple formats. This is it. It has 1 less toughness, but adds the ability to hit enchantments. In addition to seeing sideboard play in multiple formats, the Sage has also seen heavy play in toolbox decks in multiple formats. These are decks that run lots of singleton creatures that can be tutored up when a situation calls for it. This has often been accomplished using Birthing Pod or Court of Calling. Reclamation Sage is going to keep gaining points in the future and has a good chance at remaining on the list. At number 6, it's Paradise Druid, which didn't make the list in 2019, as it had only very recently been printed. For 1 generic and a green, it's a 2/1 that can tap for 1 mana of any color, and it has hexproof while it's untapped. That's a pretty nice thing to have on a creature who can tap for mana, because one of the worst feelings you can have when you play a mana creature and you start planning ahead to what you're going to do with that extra mana is that your opponent kills it. Paradise Druid gets around that, making it much more likely that she will produce mana before getting taken down. She was very heavily played in Standard, where she was pretty close to a staple, and she's gained a few points in Pioneer Landless Spy, Niv-Mizzet Reborn, and Jeskai Ascendancy decks, as well as Historic Jund Sacrifice. The Druid has slowed down since rotating out of Standard, but it is likely to gain more points in the future. At number 4, I've got 4 cards: Quirion Ranger, Heritage Druid, Birchlore Rangers, and Nettle Sentinel. None of these were on the list last time, though they barely missed making the cut. I included them all together because they've been played together in a ton of elf combo decks in multiple formats, and they are cards you kind of have to talk about together anyway because of that. Quirion Ranger is a 1/1 for 1 green mana, and he can return a forest you control to your hand to untap a creature. You can only activate the ability once a turn. Heritage Druid and Birchlore Rangers are very similar cards. They are both 1 mana 1/1s that let you tap elves for mana. The Rangers let you tap 2 elves for 1 mana of any color, and Heritage Druid lets you tap 3 untapped elves to add 3 green. Nettle Sentinel is a 1 mana 2/2 that doesn't untap during your untap step, but it untaps every time you play a green spell. So, the key to these elf combo decks, which have shown up in Extended and Legacy the most prominently, is Glimpse of Nature. This 1 mana sorcery draws you a card every time you play a creature spell for the rest of your turn, and if you can get these elves in play, you can really go off, and usually just draw your entire deck until you find a win condition. Birchlore Rangers and Heritage Druid both let you tap elves for mana, and you can do it regardless of summoning sickness. Quirion Ranger helps you untap elves for more mana, and Nettle Sentinel is going to be tapping and untapping a ton the turn you go off, and because you're drawing your whole deck, you're likely to end up with several Nettle Sentinels in play, and you can see how that would allow you to go infinite. This combo was first abused in Extended, and it was so good that Glimpse got banned preemptively in Modern to keep elf decks in that format from having such a potent combo angle. But the deck's legacy continues in, well, Legacy, and that's not going to be changing anytime soon. They've all gained more than 50 points over the last 4 years, so it wouldn't be too surprising to see them move even higher in the future. At number 4, it's Elvish Reclaimer, which is a newcomer to the list. It was around in December 2019, but it was a very new card. For 1 green mana, the Reclaimer is a 1/2, and it gets +2/+2 as long as there are 3 or more lands in your graveyard. It helps you get there too, because it has an activated ability, where you can pay 2, tap it, and sack a land to search your library for a land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Not only does that help the Reclaimer get bigger, it also is just a really good ability, because the Reclaimer can get any land, not just basics or lands with basic land types. As you'd expect, the Reclaimer has seen play in decks that are very focused on powerful non-basics. It didn't see any play in Standard or Pioneer, but it has been successful in every other paper format. In Modern, it's often used to find Valakut or Urza's Saga. In Legacy, it's used to grab Cloudpost or Gaia's Cradle. And in both Legacy and Vintage, it's used to more easily assemble the Thespian Stage Dark Depths combo, which gives you a 20/20 flyer right away. Elvish Reclaimer is going to keep gaining points, as it's just one of the best ways to tutor up lands in the entire game, and it is a pretty good shot at ascending even higher on the list in the future, especially because it just barely finished behind the number 3 card, which is Bloodbraid Elf, which was also at number 3 last time. For 2 generic, a red and a green, Bloodbraid Elf is a 3/2 with haste and cascade. Whenever you cast a card with cascade, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less. Then you can cast that card without paying its mana cost. In other words, this elf adds a body to the board that can immediately crack in for 3, and it is always going to give you another spell too. Most cards with Cascade are played to combo off with manaless cards with Suspend, but that's not really true of Bloodbraid Elf, which was played on its own merits. It saw a lot of play in Standard and Modern Jund decks. One of the most famous plays in the Modern deck was hitting Liliana of the Veil with Cascade, which was pretty tough for anyone to come back from. But even just hitting something like Lightning Bolt with the elf feels great. It was a little too good for Modern, and it got banned in 2013. It did get unbanned in 2018 though, and since then it's gone back to work in the format, though it's nowhere near as dominant as it was during the early days of the format. The 17 points it's gained over the last 4 years pales in comparison to what Elvish Reclaimer and the Glimpse combo elves have done, so it's fairly certain that Bloodbraid Elf will slip down this list in the future. At number 2, I've included 2 cards, Lana War Elves, which has a high enough score for the number 2 slot on the list, and Elvish Mystic, which would have been at number 3. I included them in the same slot because they are identical in all but name. There's actually also Findhorn Elves, but it doesn't have enough points for this list. These are both 1 mana 1/1 creatures who can tap for green mana, and they even have the same type line of Elf Druid. 1 mana mana dorks are great, as they really accelerate your mana. Lana War Elves is the oldest of the 2, making its appearance in Magic's very first set back in 1993. Elvish Mystic is much newer, only making its debut in 2014. If you're wondering what the point was in printing these 2 cards with different names, it has to do with flavor. Lana War is a place on Dominaria, so if they wanted to print a 1 mana mana elf in sets that are set elsewhere, they had to give it a different name, a more generic one, and that's how you end up with Elvish Mystic. But yeah, Llanowar Elves has been reprinted tons of times. It's one of the most reprinted cards in the entire game. This means it has had standard legality for much of its history, helping it to achieve its high score. It's also seen play outside of standard, of course, but that is where most of its points have come. The Elves have such a long and varied history that going through all the different green decks that they've been played in over the years would probably take like 10 minutes. So suffice it to say, these mana elves have been played in lots of decks because their ability to help you play 3 mana cards on turn 2 is hugely powerful. They're going to keep gaining points, but so is a number 1 card, which is Deathright Shaman. For 1 hybrid black-green mana, the Shaman is a 1/2 with 3 activated abilities that exile cards of a certain type from the graveyard for an effect. It can tap to exile a land and add 1 mana. You can pay 1 black and tap it to exile an instant or sorcery and make each opponent lose 2 life, or you can pay a green and tap it and exile a creature card to gain 2 life. The fact the Shaman has these 3 abilities has led to some players referring to it as a 1 mana planeswalker, and sometimes it does feel like it's generating similar value to a loyalty ability every turn. It provides graveyard hate while ramping your mana, pressuring your opponent, or helping you stabilize. While it found some success in Standard, its power has been abused the most in Modern and Legacy formats with access to easy ways to load the graveyard, and importantly, fetch lands. Alongside fetch lands, Deathright Shaman became a mana dork just like Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystic, but with way more upside. It eventually became clear that the card was too good for Modern, and it got banned out of the format in February of 2014. In the short time it was legal there, it amassed 40 points, so banning it was a good call. It continued to be legal in Legacy though, where it was primarily featured in Delver decks. Just like in Modern, it eventually proved to be too good for the format and it got banned there in July of 2018. It remains legal in Pioneer and Vintage, and those are 2 formats where it still sees significant play. Additionally, the introduction of the Timeless format in Magic Arena is good news for Deathright Shaman because it features fetch lands, and that could lead to some serious success for the Shaman as well. You just can't keep Deathright Shaman down even with a bunch of bans, and it's likely to keep gaining points in the future. So, those are the top 10 elves. If you'd like to own any of them, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the almost 700 other MTG top 10s, including many more that look at specific creature types, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.